face on your $2 bill wrote that all men are created equal. He owned more than 600 human beings. The man on your quarter led a revolution for liberty and hunted his own enslaved people across state lines when they tried to claim it. The man who designed your entire financial system was gunned down in a duel by the sitting Vice President of the United States. And the story you were told about all of them, in every classroom, on every monument, in every Independence Day speech, leaves out the parts that would actually make you understand who they really were. This isn't about tearing down the founding of America. It's about something far more unsettling. The gap between the men we've been handed and the men who actually walked those rooms, made those deals, and left behind paper trails that historians are still untangling today. The official story gave you marble. The real story gives you flesh and blood, and a whole lot of uncomfortable questions that nobody ever put in the textbook. We're going to go there today, all the way. Before we do, if you've ever felt like the version of history you were taught was cleaned up for your consumption, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I'm always genuinely curious. And if this is the kind of story that deserves to exist, one that doesn't flinch, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started, and what's coming next makes this opening look tame. Let's go back, not to the pretty painting of the signing, not to the soaring rhetoric. Let's go back to the actual rooms, the actual men, and what was actually happening behind the closed doors of the most consequential political project in modern history. Philadelphia, summer of 1776.
The air inside the Pennsylvania State House is thick, not with the heat of revolutionary passion,
but with the literal, suffocating heat of a mid-Atlantic July, and the smell of horses and unwashed wool, and the tension of men who know that what they are about to do could get every single one of them hanged. Outside those windows, a city is buzzing with rumor. Inside, something stranger than revolution is happening. The men who are building a new nation are simultaneously arguing about whether the human beings they own should count as people or property. And the answer they arrive at will haunt the country for the next 2.5 centuries. The part of the founding that tends to get softened in the telling is not the brilliance, and the brilliance was real. It's not the sacrifice, and the sacrifice was real. It's the ruthless, transactional nature of the compromises these men made, and what those compromises cost people who never had a seat at the table, never had a vote, never had a name recorded in any official document until a DNA test in 1998 changed everything. The men who built America were not marble. They were complicated, contradictory, sometimes terrifying, and occasionally great. Sometimes all four at once. Take the group at the top: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams. These are the names carved into buildings, stamped on currency, taught to children before they can read full sentences. The mythology around them is so thick that even historians who know better sometimes struggle to see through it. What you were taught was a kind of secular religion. The founding fathers as saints, their documents as scripture, their contradictions as footnotes rather than central facts. But contradictions this large don't fit in footnotes. Washington, the man on the $1 bill, the father of the country, the general who won the Revolution, was one of the wealthiest slaveholders in Virginia at a time when wealth and slavery were essentially the same thing. He inherited his first enslaved workers as a child. By the time he died, the records show that close to 300 people were held in bondage at Mount Vernon, some owned outright, others belonging to the estate of his wife's family, all of them bound to the same land. And when the capital moved to Philadelphia, he did something that tells you everything you need to know about the gap between his public ideals and his private calculations. Pennsylvania had passed a law in 1780, during the Revolution itself, while Washington was still commanding armies fighting for liberty, that said any enslaved person who lived in the state for 6 consecutive months would become free.
By the time Washington took office and moved his household to Philadelphia, that law was sitting there, on the books, fully in force. He knew about it. His own secretary documented what he did about it. Washington rotated his enslaved household staff, sending them back to Virginia just before the 6-month mark, then bringing them back, specifically to prevent them from qualifying. He did this quietly, deliberately, and with full awareness of what he was doing. This is not a man who was simply a product of his time and couldn't see past it. This is a man who understood the logic of freedom well enough to win a war over it, and understood the law of freedom in Pennsylvania well enough to carefully, legally circumvent it, year after year. Picture this. The revolution is over. The nation is new. And the same men who signed their names to a declaration that all men are created equal are going home to plantations where other men wake up before dawn, work until dark, and have no legal claim to their own children, their own bodies, or their own names. The dissonance is not lost on historians. It wasn't even lost on people at the time. The abolitionist Moncure Conway, himself from Virginia, and a man who had studied Jefferson closely, put it in terms so sharp they still cut. Never did any man achieve greater fame for what he did not do. He was talking about Jefferson specifically, the man who wrote the most celebrated words about freedom in the English language, and then spent the rest of his life finding reasons not to apply them. Jefferson is the paradox at the heart of the founding. More than anyone else, he is the reason the gap between ideal and reality is so vast. Because, more than anyone else, he articulated the ideal. 4 words: all men are created equal. When he wrote them, they meant something explosive. Massachusetts freed its enslaved population based on those words. 6 southern states were so alarmed by the plain meaning of all men that their own constitutional framers changed the language, replacing all men with all free citizens, because they understood perfectly what Jefferson had implied, and they couldn't accept it. Jefferson knew what he'd written. He was not confused about it. In his original draft of the Declaration, he included a passage condemning the slave trade, in language so fierce it's almost unrecognizable as the same man. He called it in, quote, 4, quote, 5. The Continental Congress deleted it, under pressure from South Carolina and Georgia. Jefferson let it go. He let it go, and then he went home to Monticello, and for the next 4 decades, the most poetically gifted voice for human liberty in American political history, said almost nothing about slavery in public. Historian David Bryan Davis spent a career trying to understand this silence. His conclusion was bleak. By the last decade of the 18th century, he wrote, quote, every attempt at emancipation that might have worked, and some had real potential, quietly died. And Jefferson was quiet while they died. Why? That question is where the story stops being comfortable. Monticello sits on a hill in Virginia. If you visit it today, and you should, you climb through forest and mist, and the house appears above you like something out of a dream, all neoclassical elegance and impossible precision. A building that seems designed to make you feel that whoever built it must have been purely, philosophically devoted to beauty and reason. One visitor in Jefferson's time said that if the place weren't called Monticello, he'd call it Olympus and its owner, Jupiter. That image was engineered. Jefferson had read his Palladio. The architect's principle was that the beautiful parts of a structure should be visible to the world, and the less elegant parts should be hidden from sight. Monticello was built on that principle, not just architecturally, but morally. Beneath the gracious dining room, there were tunnels. The guests at Jefferson's famous dinner parties never saw the food arrive, and never saw the dishes disappear, because there were enslaved workers moving through underground passages, ferrying trays and bottles and ice, invisible by design. Jefferson had a dumbwaiter built into his fireplace,
a contraption that looked like magic to his guests. Place an empty wine bottle in the slot, and a full one would appear. What they couldn't see was the enslaved man sitting in the cellar below, waiting, making the trick work. The invisible labor that sustained Jefferson's vision of civilized life was literally built into the walls. None of this was accidental. Jefferson thought deeply about optics, about what people saw and what they were allowed to see. He walked his terrace every morning, looking out at what he called his community. Hundreds of people he owned, organized into a complex economic operation that included blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, nail makers, brewers, cooks trained in French cuisine. Monticello was not a plantation in the romantic sense. It was a small city with a main street called Mulberry Row, where the enslaved lived in rough wooden cabins that one of the few visitors who actually saw them described as poor and uncomfortable. She only mentioned it in passing. Most guests never went near. Around 1792, Jefferson was working through his accounts, writing to President Washington about the finances of the plantation, when something clicked in his thinking in a way that changed him forever. He realized, for what seems to have been the first time as a deliberate calculation, that the enslaved people at Monticello were not merely workers. They were assets that generated their own growth. He wrote it down with the detachment of a man calculating compound interest. The births of enslaved children increased the value of his estate at a steady annual rate. The children were profit. The women who bore them were, in his accounting, a form of capital investment. He later wrote to a friend in financial difficulty that he should invest in enslaved people. The returns, Jefferson calculated, were reliable and self-perpetuating. The man who wrote that all men are created equal had, by middle age, worked out the mathematics of human bondage and found them satisfactory. That is not a footnote. That is the center of the story. And then there is what was hidden inside Monticello itself, what archaeologists found when they dug beneath the South Terrace, what Monticello curators confirmed, what changed the way the site presents Jefferson's life forever. A room, small, private, connected to his bedroom. A room that for nearly 200 years had been filled in, built over, erased. And what that room represented is the story that America spent more than a century and a half refusing to acknowledge. A secret kept not just by Jefferson's descendants, but by the entire machinery of American historical memory, until a genetic test ripped the silence apart. The nail boys of Monticello deserve a moment before we get there. Because this detail is so specific, so documented, and so perfectly illustrative of the distance between the Jefferson of the speeches and the Jefferson of the records, that it stops you cold. Jefferson ran a nail-making operation using enslaved children, boys as young as 10, 11, 12 years old, who worked in a hot, smoky workshop producing thousands of nails a day. The income from their labor paid for the food for Jefferson's white family. When production slowed, when nails weren't made fast enough, the boys were beaten. One was beaten so badly he suffered a fractured skull. Another was sold south, as Jefferson himself put it, as a warning to the others, as if death had carried him off. This passage was deliberately removed from the published version of Jefferson's farm book when it was edited for a 1953 edition. Not summarized, not contextualized, deleted. A children's biography published in 1941 described the same workshop this way. In his industrial hive, there were no discords and no unkindness. On the beaming black faces of the slaves as they worked under their master's direction, there was no trace of discontent. The women sang at their work, and the older children, in their leisure time, made nails, not overworking and for fun. Time magazine named it one of the most important children's books of that year. It was reissued in 1961 under the title, Thomas Jefferson, Fighter for Freedom and Human Rights. This is how myths are made and maintained, not through a single big lie, but through 10,000 small omissions, softened framings, and deleted passages. generation after generation, until the sanitized version feels like the truth. Now hold that image. Jefferson at his desk, calculating the returns on human life, erasing what he'd rather not see. And consider that beneath all of it, literally beneath the floor of his private quarters, there was a woman whose existence threatened to unravel the entire carefully constructed image. A woman whose children looked like him, whose great-great-grandchildren would eventually submit to DNA testing, whose name was Sally Hemings, and whose story was the most effectively buried secret in American presidential history. Hidden not for years, not for decades, but for a century and a half, by historians, by Jefferson's family, by institutions, by the sheer weight of a nation's need to believe in its own creation myth. The year is 1787.
A 14-year-old girl boards a ship in Virginia, crosses the Atlantic, and arrives in Paris to serve as a companion to Jefferson's youngest daughter. Jefferson is 44 years old, freshly widowed, the American minister to France. He is also, by all accounts, a man who has sworn on his dying wife's deathbed never to remarry. Sally Hemings is, by blood, the half-sister of that dead wife, because Jefferson's father-in-law had fathered children by an enslaved woman named Betty Hemings, and Sally was one of them. So when Jefferson looks at Sally Hemings, he is looking at someone who carries the face of the woman he loved and lost. That fact has made some historians see tragedy. Others see something considerably darker. What happened in Paris is not in dispute. Not by the DNA evidence, not by the historical record, and not by the testimony of Sally's son, Madison Hemings, who in 1873 sat down with a journalist and said it plainly. Thomas Jefferson was his father. All four of the Hemings children who survived to adulthood were Jeffersons. Madison was measured and careful, not bitter, almost clinical in his description of a relationship that the most powerful machinery of American historical reputation would spend the next 125 years insisting could not possibly have happened. The machinery was impressive. The Jefferson biographer Dumas Malone, who spent 6 volumes and decades of his life constructing the monument, dismissed it as, quote, 10, spread by a journalist, quote, 11, the association with one of Jefferson's political enemies made it easy to dismiss. The fact that the same story was confirmed by other witnesses who had no political motive, by the internal logic of plantation records, by the timing of Sally's pregnancies, by the accounting of Jefferson's presence at Monticello, all of that could be, and was, explained away, or simply ignored, for well over a century. Because the erasure of Sally Hemings was not just about Jefferson. It was about what Americans needed to believe. The historian Annette Gordon Reed, who spent years arguing before anyone wanted to listen, that the historical dismissal of Hemings was rooted in racism as much as evidence, put it directly. If it had become accepted knowledge in the 19th century that Jefferson maintained a decades-long relationship with an enslaved woman, he would not be on Mount Rushmore. He might not be on the $2 bill. The entire symbolic architecture of what he represents to American identity would have cracked. So the story was managed, not through a formal conspiracy, but through something more powerful. A shared cultural investment in a certain version of the past, and the willingness of gatekeepers, historians, editors, institutions, to let convenient interpretations survive and uncomfortable ones disappear. What emerged from the DNA results of 1998 was not just confirmation of what Madison Hemings had said 125 years earlier. It was a revelation about how history actually works, about who gets to tell it, and what they decide to leave out, and why. In 1789, as the French Revolution was tearing Paris apart, Jefferson prepared to return to Virginia. Sally Hemings was pregnant. By French law, which did not recognize slavery, she had the right to walk to any police station and claim her freedom.
She could have stayed. Some of Jefferson's other enslaved staff were being urged by Parisian servants to do exactly that. Sally's brother James was seriously considering it. By every legal mechanism available to her, Sally Hemings could have been a free woman. She went back. The stories about why she went back come mostly from Madison Hemings, who got them from his mother. Jefferson promised her certain privileges.
He promised that the children would be freed when they came of age. He asked her to return with him, and she did. Whether this was love, or coercion that felt like love, or something that had no name in the language of the time, historians still argue. But she went back, and for the next 38 years, she lived in a room beneath Jefferson's private quarters at Monticello, bore him at least 6 children, and remained legally his property until the day he died. Jefferson freed exactly 10 people in his lifetime, and in his will, every single one of them was either a member of the Hemings family or a person connected to them. Sally herself was not freed by name in his will. She appeared in the post-death inventory of his estate because Jefferson died bankrupt, his debts enormous, listed with a value of $30. His daughter Martha quietly allowed Sally to leave without formal papers. She lived her last 9 years in Charlottesville with her sons Madison and Eston, a free woman without documentation, legally still property, practically allowed to exist as something else. The children scattered. 3 of them were light-skinned enough to pass as white, and they did. They moved north, married into white society, and their descendants lived as white Americans, sometimes for generations, sometimes without any knowledge of where they came from. Eston eventually changed his surname to Jefferson. A great-grandchild of Sally Hemings became the first black man elected to the California state legislature. 2 branches of the same family, one white, one black. Descendants of the same man and the same woman, riding separate buses 100 years after his death. Now, there's one more layer of the Jefferson story that cuts even deeper than Sally Hemings, because it's about a promise made not in Paris, but right here on Virginia soil. A promise to a man who had given Jefferson something irreplaceable, and a promise Jefferson chose, with full deliberateness, not to keep. Sally's brother, James Hemings, was brought to Paris by Jefferson specifically to be trained as a French chef. Jefferson wanted to import French cooking to Virginia, and he wanted to own the chef who could produce it. James spent years in Paris, trained under professional cooks, mastered a cuisine that would make Jefferson's dinner parties legendary. He was, by any objective measure, a skilled professional tradesman. Exactly the kind of person who, in the free world 1 ocean away, would have commanded a salary, a reputation, a life of his own construction. When they returned to Virginia, Jefferson promised James his freedom in exchange for training another enslaved man to take his place in the kitchen. James did it. He trained his replacement with such thoroughness that Jefferson's kitchen continued to produce the same food after James was gone. And Jefferson freed him. Legally, on paper. But James Hemings walked out of Monticello into an America that had no infrastructure for what he was. No land, no savings, no network of people who would hire a free black man in Virginia in the 1790s for what his skills were actually worth. Freedom without resources, in the landscape Jefferson had helped create, was a kind of liberty that had no practical content. James drifted. He worked as a hired cook in Baltimore and Philadelphia. He came back to Monticello for a period, working as a paid employee for his former enslaver, because the economics of his freedom made it the rational choice. In 1801, the same year Jefferson became President of the United States, James Hemings died. The records say it was suicide, though some historians note the evidence is incomplete. He was 36 years old. Jefferson recorded his death in his account book. The entry is 4 words long. That is the full weight of the Jefferson paradox.
compressed into 4 words and a ledger page. A man trained in Paris at Jefferson's expense, freed by Jefferson's hand, dead at 36 in the year his former enslaver took the most powerful office in the new republic. The founding generation did not just build a nation.
They built the specific contradictions that nation would spend the next 2.5 centuries trying to resolve. But Jefferson and Washington are only 2 of the figures whose private realities diverge so dramatically from the public mythology. Travel north, not to Paris, not to Philadelphia, but to the beating financial heart of the new republic, to a city that even then had the particular electric energy that American cities get when money and ambition and danger are all in the same room at the same time. New York, the 1790s. A man who had no plantation, no inherited wealth, no Virginia pedigree, a man who had built everything he had from nothing, from words on paper and the ferocious velocity of a mind that never seemed to slow down. Alexander Hamilton arrived in America as a teenager from the Caribbean, from Nevis, an island whose economy was built entirely on sugar and the enslaved labor that produced it. He grew up surrounded by the machinery of slavery in its most brutal industrial form. The Sugar Islands were not the genteel plantation world of Virginia, where the mythology of the benevolent master had at least a surface to which it could cling. The Caribbean was raw. The mortality rate among the enslaved was catastrophic. Planters imported new human beings constantly because the labor destroyed people faster than they could be replaced by birth. Hamilton saw this as a child. He worked in a counting house where the financial instruments of the slave trade moved through his hands daily. He understood, from the age of 11 or 12, exactly what the commerce in human beings looked like when you stripped away every pretense. And then he came north. He joined an abolitionist society in New York. He helped found what would become the New York Manumission Society, a genuine anti-slavery organization whose members included some of the most prominent men in the city. These are documented facts, so are the ones that follow, and they pull in the opposite direction. Recent scholarship has established that Hamilton's household in New York made use of enslaved labor on at least several occasions. Records show transactions and arrangements that complicate the portrait of Hamilton as purely an anti-slavery figure. The picture that emerges is not of a committed abolitionist who kept his hands clean. It's of a man who opposed slavery in principle and accommodated it in practice when the accommodation served him. Sound familiar? The founders had a gift for that particular combination. But Hamilton's financial system, the architecture he built as Secretary of the Treasury, is where his contradiction scales up to something that dwarfs the personal. The system he designed tied Southern participation to Northern finance so thoroughly that it made the slave economy structurally central to American prosperity. The assumption of state debts, the Bank of the United States, the valorization of merchant capital, these were not ideologically neutral instruments. They created interdependencies that made the plantation economy and the Northern financial economy mutually reinforcing in ways that would take a civil war to sever. Hamilton understood finance at a level that no one else in the founding generation approached. He knew what he was building. He knew who benefited and who was being monetized. And he built it anyway, because without the South's participation, the financial union didn't work. And without the financial union, the republic dissolved. This is Hamilton's version of Jefferson's paradox. Different in scale, different in texture, but structurally identical in its logic. He saw the rot at the foundation, chose the architecture anyway, and told himself, and maybe believed, that the structure would eventually make the rot impossible to sustain. But Hamilton's most operatic contradiction was not about slavery. It was about the specific way that a man who had survived poverty and illegitimacy and the chaos of a Caribbean childhood builds a life of respectability, and then watches the most spectacular implosion possible happen in real time, in public, at the worst possible moment.
and responds in the most Hamilton way imaginable, by writing a 95-page document confessing everything. The year is 1791. Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury, at the absolute peak of his institutional power. His reputation for financial probity, for being the man who, above all others, could be trusted to handle the nation's money honestly, is the foundation on which everything he has built depends. And then Maria Reynolds knocks on his door. She tells him her husband has abandoned her. She is in distress. Hamilton gives her money. He visits her at her lodgings on Mulberry Street. The affair begins. It continues for months. And then her husband, James Reynolds, appears. James Reynolds was not an abandoned husband. He was a schemer, operating in the same financial world Hamilton dominated, a world of speculation and insider information, and the kind of opportunities that existed in the gap between public policy and private knowledge. He had, in all likelihood, sent Maria to Hamilton deliberately, because now he had leverage over the most powerful financial official in the Republic. James Reynolds began collecting money from Hamilton in exchange for silence. And Hamilton, astonishing, brilliant, self-destructive Hamilton, paid. For months, he paid. The scheme unraveled in 1792, when James Reynolds was arrested for an unrelated fraud. In prison, looking for a bargaining chip, he told investigators that Hamilton had been his partner in illegal financial speculation. The investigators, a senator, a congressman, and a future president of the United States named James Monroe, went to Hamilton and confronted him. Imagine the room. 3 men across a table from the most powerful financial mind in America, accusing him of corruption. Hamilton listens to the accusation. He understands immediately what it means, not just politically, not just professionally, but personally. He decides, in that room, to confess everything. There was no corruption of public funds. There was an affair. There was extortion. There was a man paying hush money to avoid scandal. Hamilton explains all of this, produces the letters, shows the payments. The investigators, apparently satisfied the corruption charge is unfounded, agree to keep what they heard confidential. The matter is buried for 5 years. And then in 1797, with Hamilton no longer in office, with political warfare between Federalists and Republicans reaching a pitch that makes everything a weapon, a journalist named James Callender publishes a pamphlet. He has the letters. He publishes everything. Hamilton's response is, depending on your perspective, either the bravest or the most catastrophically self-defeating act in the political history of the founding generation. He writes back. Not a denial, not a dignified silence, not the careful non-response that any experienced political survivor would choose. He writes 95 pages, confessing the affair in explicit detail, refuting the corruption charge, essentially destroying his own reputation in order to defend his financial honor. He calculated that admitting to adultery was preferable to letting anyone believe he had stolen from the public treasury. His marriage to Eliza Hamilton, a woman who, by every available account, was one of the more dignified and wronged figures in this entire story, absorbed the impact in public, while she processed it privately, in ways the historical record only partially captures. The Reynolds pamphlet delighted his enemies. It horrified his allies. And it was written by the same journalist, James Callender, who would, a few years later, become the primary vehicle for making the Sally Hemings story public, after Jefferson rewarded him with a political appointment that Callender felt was inadequate, and responded to by exposing every secret he had been sitting on. The 2 most explosive private scandals of the founding generation were connected by the same angry, mercenary pen. History is not tidy. The confession did not destroy Hamilton. Not completely, not immediately. What it did was transform him. It converted him from a man whose power came from institutional authority into something more dangerous and less controllable. A man with nothing left to lose in the conventional sense, operating entirely on the basis of reputation and conviction and the furious velocity of his own mind. That kind of man, in a world of calculated political actors, is unpredictable in ways that frighten people who deal only in calculations. Jefferson was watching. The relationship between Hamilton and Jefferson is one of the foundational antagonisms of American political history, and it is usually taught as a policy disagreement. Hamilton for a strong central government and commercial finance, Jefferson for agrarian democracy and states' rights. That disagreement was real, but underneath the policy, the thing that made it so vicious, so personal, so enduring, was something closer to mutual recognition.
Each man saw in the other's position the implications of his own contradictions, spelled out in ways that were acutely uncomfortable. Jefferson looked at Hamilton's financial system and saw, correctly, that it created a class of wealthy financiers whose interests were bound to federal power, and that this concentration of economic and political influence was exactly the kind of aristocratic structure the Revolution had been fought to prevent. What he said about it in public was principled and rhetorically beautiful. What he did about it in private was something else. He hired a journalist named Philip Freneau to a job in his State Department, while Freneau simultaneously ran a newspaper that existed primarily to attack Hamilton. Freneau's National Gazette called Hamilton a monarchist, a would-be king, a man working to subvert the Republic. Jefferson denied any connection. The connection was documented. He denied it anyway. Hamilton looked at Jefferson and saw, with a precision that still holds up, a man whose political philosophy was funded by enslaved labor and insulated from the practical consequences of its own idealism by inherited wealth. He called Jefferson a coward and a dissembler, a man who hired others to do the dirty work of political destruction while maintaining a surface of philosophical detachment. He was not wrong, and he was not safe. Because Jefferson, by the time the 1790s were ending, was not merely a political opponent, he was a potential president. He was the leader of a faction consolidating power with frightening efficiency. And he had, in his orbit, people who knew things about Hamilton's finances, about the Reynolds affair, about the gap between Hamilton's public positions and his private behaviors. Things that could be deployed at the right moment with surgical precision. Hamilton had his own intelligence. He had been Secretary of the Treasury. He had seen the books. He understood the full financial picture of the Virginia planter class, the debts, the dependencies, the elaborate structures by which men who preached agrarian simplicity maintained lives of extraordinary luxury on a foundation that was simultaneously expanding and collapsing. He knew what Monticello actually cost. He knew the numbers behind the philosophy, and he was not above using what he knew. Two of the most brilliant men in the founding generation, each one carrying secrets that, if fully exposed, would have changed the historical record. Each one aware, not in every detail, but in the way that intelligent men who operate in the same world develop a peripheral awareness of each other's vulnerabilities, that the other had leverage. Each one watching a political moment approaching that was going to force a confrontation neither could entirely control. Washington is dead. The first president, the gravitational center who had kept the factions in something like orbit, is gone. The election of 1800 is coming, the most savage political contest the Republic has yet faced. Jefferson is running, Adams is running, and Hamilton, frozen out of direct power, his reputation scorched by the Reynolds confession, his influence operating through back channels and furious correspondence, is playing a game whose rules he is partially making up as he goes. The man Hamilton fears most in that election is not Jefferson.
the man Hamilton fears most is Aaron Burr. And Burr knows everything.
Aaron Burr knew where the bodies were buried. Not metaphorically, though that too, but in the specific practical sense that a man who has spent decades inside the machinery of American political power accumulates a kind of knowledge that functions like a loaded weapon. He knew about Hamilton's finances. He knew about Jefferson's Monticello. He had been in the rooms. He had heard the conversations. He had read correspondence that was never meant to leave private hands. And in the winter of 1800, as the most dangerous election in the Republic's short history approached, Aaron Burr was the one man in America that both Jefferson and Hamilton needed to manage simultaneously, and the one man neither of them could fully control. What Hamilton knew about Burr was this: Burr was not an ideologue. Jefferson had his philosophy, however hypocritically applied. Hamilton had his vision of commercial empire, however messily implemented. Burr had something that both men found far more frightening than a competing ideology. Burr had pure, undiluted political intelligence, deployed without the constraint of any organizing principle beyond his own advancement. He was the founding generation's most gifted practitioner of the thing they all practiced, but none of them wanted to admit they practiced: the art of power for its own sake. Hamilton wrote about Burr in terms that oscillated between contempt and something that reads in the letters almost like awe. He called him a man of irregular and insatiable ambition. He warned his allies that Burr would, if given the chance, bend the institutions of the Republic to his personal ends in ways that even the most cynical observer would find alarming. He said this while himself deploying every instrument of back-channel influence available to a man with no official position and an enormous network of private correspondence. The accusation was accurate. The hypocrisy was total. And Burr understood both. Set Burr aside for a moment, like a card face down on the table, the one that determines the whole hand not yet flipped. Because what was actually happening in those years, in those rooms, between those men, was something none of them named and none of them fully acknowledged. Something operating at a level more fundamental than any individual's ambition or any specific political scheme. What was actually happening was the construction of a system. Not a conspiracy, in the way that word usually gets used. Not a secret meeting, not a handshake in a back room, not a document signed by men who knew they were doing something they'd have to hide. Something more architectural than that. Something built the way all durable structures get built, through a series of individual decisions, each one defensible on its own terms, each one made by people with genuine reasons for making it, that aggregate into something none of them individually chose, but all of them collectively produced. Something that, once built, becomes invisible precisely because it becomes the background against which everything else happens. The men who built the American Republic faced a problem with no clean solution. They needed to create a unified nation out of 13 colonies with radically different economic structures, different social hierarchies, different relationships to labor and land and the meaning of freedom. The northern states had economies built on trade, manufacturing, and nominally free labor. The southern states had economies built on something else entirely. Something that made their land productive and their planters wealthy and their political class powerful. And something that was constitutionally, morally, and practically incompatible with the philosophical foundations the founders were simultaneously articulating. They could not resolve this contradiction. They knew they could not resolve it. The records of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, Madison's notes, documents kept secret for decades and only published after most of the participants were dead, make this absolutely clear. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia told the convention, without diplomatic softening, that their states would not join a union that threatened slavery.
Not might not, would not. The Union required their participation.
Their participation required a guarantee, and so the guarantee was written in, encoded in the text of the Constitution itself, in language so carefully chosen that it managed to protect the institution without ever using the word. The 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the 20-year protection of the international slave trade, the requirement that the federal government suppress domestic insurrections, a provision whose primary practical application, everyone in the room understood, was the suppression of slave revolts. These were not oversights. They were the price of union, negotiated explicitly, written deliberately, and understood by every man who signed that document as exactly what they were. A structural guarantee to the slave states that the new federal government would not merely tolerate slavery, but would actively protect it. Madison knew this. He was the primary architect of the document. He took the notes. He left behind a paper trail of almost painful clarity about what he understood. He wrote privately, in the correspondence that the founding generation reserved for its honesty, that the real division in America was not between large states and small states, as the convention officially framed it, but between the slaveholding states and the free states. The convention's official framing was a useful fiction. Madison knew it was a fiction. He maintained it because the alternative, openly acknowledging that the republic was being constituted along the fault line of slavery, would have made the fault line visible in ways the coalition could not survive. And here is the catastrophic irony of the structure they built. The constitutional protection of slavery did not maintain the institution as it existed in 1787. It gave the slave states a structural advantage in federal politics that they used for the next 70 years to expand the institution rather than allow it to contract. The 3/5 Clause gave the South more seats in Congress and more votes in the Electoral College than its free population warranted, which meant the slaveholding interest was systematically overrepresented in every federal decision for 7 decades. The Fugitive Slave Clause meant that free states had to actively participate in returning escaped enslaved people. Their courts, their officials, their citizens conscripted into enforcing an institution their own states had abolished. The 20-year protection of the slave trade allowed the importation of hundreds of thousands more people into bondage in the years after ratification, expanding the institution at precisely the moment when the founders, who privately opposed it, hoped it might begin to contract. The structure they built did not let slavery quietly expire. It supercharged it. Now pull back, wider, because this is where the story becomes something beyond the private contradictions of specific men and their specific secrets. What were they actually building? Not in their stated intentions, in the structure that emerged from their choices. A republic whose founding documents articulated a universalist vision of human freedom, so powerful, it became the most exported political idea in modern history. A vision that inspired revolutions on 3 continents, that provided the language for every subsequent liberation movement, that still functions as the most effective rhetorical weapon available to anyone arguing for human dignity against the power of the state. And simultaneously, in the same documents, with the same pens, in the same rooms, a system of political economy that made the brutalization of millions of people not merely permissible, but constitutionally guaranteed. A system that generated the capital accumulation which funded the Industrial Revolution, that produced the cotton which clothed the working class of England and the mills of New England, that built the financial instruments and insurance structures and commodity markets whose structural descendants still shape global finance today. The enslaved labor that built the White House and the Capitol building, the physical structures of American democracy, was not an irony the founders overlooked. It was an expression of the actual relationship between the ideals and the machinery that sustained them.
These two things were not in tension with each other, in the way historical memory tends to present them, as if the contradiction were a problem the founders were trying to solve and simply ran out of time. They were structurally interdependent. The universalist language worked as well as it did precisely because it operated at a level of abstraction that did not require it to engage with the specific realities beneath it. All men are created equal is a statement that means everything and nothing until you ask the follow-up, which men, under which conditions, as determined by whom? The founders answered that question in the 3/5 Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause and the 20-year protection of the slave trade. Then they declined to draw attention to the answer. What emerged from that combination was a template, a way of organizing political society around soaring universal ideals that coexist with specific structural exclusions, maintained not through explicit brutality, but through the operation of law and custom and economic interest, and the simple inertia of a system once established. A template so durable and so flexible that it has been available for redeployment in every generation since, applied to different groups, maintained through different mechanisms, but recognizable in its fundamental architecture as the same structure the founders built in 1787. Reconstruction lasted 12 years before the South's political resurgence reversed most of its gains. Women didn't get the vote until 144 years after the Declaration. Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps by executive order during the Second World War, their constitutional rights suspended in the name of national security, by a president who described the New Deal as the fulfillment of the founders' promise. The mechanisms change. The architecture persists. The founding lie, and it is a lie, in the precise sense that the men who built the structure knew what they were doing and said something different in public, did not stay in the past. It became the operating system. The specific calibration the founders built between the language of universal freedom and the structure of specific exclusion became the template for every subsequent argument about who is actually included in "we the people." Every civil rights movement, every suffrage movement, every fight for legal equality has had to argue not against the founding ideals, because the founding ideals genuinely support inclusion, but against the founding structure, which was engineered to resist it. The Electoral College is still there. The structure of the Senate, which gives the least populous states the same representation as the largest, a design partly intended to protect the political power of smaller slaveholding states, is still there. The specific calibration of federal versus state authority, built as a guarantee to the slave states that the federal government could not interfere with their domestic institutions, has been the template for every subsequent argument about that boundary. From Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Act, to contemporary debates about voting rights, reproductive rights, and federal power. The argument doesn't sound like slavery anymore. It runs on the same rails. Washington rotated his enslaved staff across the Pennsylvania border to prevent them from claiming freedom, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and he proceeded anyway. Jefferson calculated the reproductive value of enslaved women as a capital investment, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and he proceeded anyway. Madison wrote the clauses that guaranteed federal protection of slavery, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and he proceeded anyway. Hamilton built the financial system that made slave-produced commodities the engine of the new republic's prosperity, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and he proceeded anyway. None of them were stupid. None of them were blind. All of them understood, with varying degrees of explicitness, the nature of what they were building. And all of them decided, for reasons that made sense in the calculus of their moment, that the structure was worth more than the contradiction it contained. The marble statues are not wrong, exactly. Washington did win the Revolution. Jefferson did write the words. Madison did design the Constitution. Hamilton did build the financial system.
These things happened, and they mattered, and they shaped the world you're sitting in right now.
But the marble is the problem. Not because it commemorates, but because it smooths. Because it takes the specific, contradictory, flesh and blood reality of what those men did and what they chose and what they knew, and converts it into something simplified and settled and closed. Something you can admire without having to reckon with. The reckoning is not about guilt. Guilt is the least useful response to history. Too personal, too focused on feeling, too easy to discharge without changing anything. The reckoning is about recognition, about looking at the structure you are living inside and understanding its architectural history, understanding which walls were load-bearing, which rooms were built to include and which to exclude, which doors were locked from the outside and which from the inside, and by whose hand, and why.
James Hemings walked out of Monticello a free man and was dead at 36. 4 words in a ledger. Sally Hemings crossed an ocean and went back, and her children scattered across a country that would spend a century and a half pretending she never existed. The nail boys worked in the smoke and the heat, while their enslaver wrote about liberty. Aaron Burr sat across a field in the mist of a New Jersey morning and raised a pistol at the man who had spent years destroying him. And the moment the shot landed, both men's secrets became permanently, irreversibly public property. The founding generation didn't just build a country. They built the specific shape of its unfinished business. And the question that doesn't close, the one worth sitting with after the documentary ends and the lights come up, is whether the people building the next version of this structure right now can see their own ledger pages clearly enough to write something different. Or whether 200 years from now, someone will be reading what we wrote and asking the same question about us.